School of Languages, Literatures, and Cultures, to give us a sort of opening welcome. Carol Mossman. Thank you.
Thank you, everyone. I feel a little strange, sort of silly talking to around table people to people there, but you're all welcome however you're configured there. This is our first symposium associated with the Maya Brin residency program. So I want to thank you all for coming from far and near to help us inaugurate this really special program. Let me tell you just a little bit about it. A couple of years we were approached by a former professor of mathematics here at the university. His mother had recently passed away, and it turns out that she had taught for many years in the Russian program here, and some of our faculty still remember teaching with us. He wanted to do something to honor her memory. And that is how the program was born. We wanted to do a program, a residency program, that allowed us to bring in a prominent scholar, artist, writer, public personality once a year, and to organize a series of events, classes, performances, workshops, lectures around a topic or a theme. I was very pleased that the Russian department made an important decision when it conceptualized the program, and that was to open it up to Russian studies broadly rather than keeping it focused on language, literature, and culture, which is also fairly broad, but in any case, they decided to actually open it up further. And I think that this elastic definition will allow us to bring together scholars in a range of disciplines, both across the campus, and we have some of those folks here today, and from the larger community. Our inaugural lecturer, Mr. Dmitry Bykov, embodies the breadth to which the Maya Brin program aspires. A poet, a biographer, a writer, a biographer of other writers, a media personality, a public intellectual speaking with a dissonant voice. We are very pleased that he accepted our invitation to become our first distinguished resident. I want to remind everyone here that Mr. Bykov will be delivering a public lecture tonight entitled Stalin as the Addressee of Soviet Literature. And that will be held in the Kelvin Library on the 6th floor in the special events room from 5 to 7. You are all welcome, and there will be a reception following that. Joining us here today for the symposium on the post-Soviet legacy is a panel of recognized and influential scholars of this subject and others related to Russian studies. I actually don't know many of the people on the panel, so maybe as I read your name, you could identify yourself for the audience. Dr. David Brandenburger from the University of Richmond, there we are. Dr. Kate Brown from the University of Maryland at Baltimore County, excellent. Dr. Sarah Cameron, right here in history. Dr. Michael David Fox, an emigre, I understand, from here over to Georgetown. Dr. Mikhail Dolbilov, here at UM in history. Dr. Sergei Ushakin, if I got that right.
Yeah, you did.
Great, from Princeton. Dr. Kevin Platt, University of Pennsylvania.
I'm on the way.
He's on the way, okay, but we'll know who it is, right? Dr. Peter Rollberg, George Washington University, thank you, and Dr. Catherine Schuler, University of Maryland Women's Studies, there she is. There are a lot of thank yous associated with this because this program has been fairly complicated to organize, and a lot of people have been involved in some of the behind-the-scenes work. So first, of course, although he's not here today, I do want to thank Dr. Michael Brin. Perhaps we will send this video to him, I don't know, but he certainly made all this possible. Dean Bonnie Thornton-Dill, who was also heavily involved in shaping the program. Liz Papazian, Chair of Russian, right there, absolutely indefatigable in every aspect of setting up the program and organizing this first residency. All of the members of the Russian department were also involved in various ways, including serving on the search committee for the distinguished Maya Brin lecturer. Doctors Mariana Landa, I'm not sure if I see her, I'm sure we'll see her later. Dr. Cindy Martin, excellent. Dr. Masha Lekic, not here at this time. Thanks also to our first distinguished, Maya Brin distinguished lecturer, Ms. Jana Vernola. She's standing in the back there. This is wonderful thing about this particular program also is that it's kind of a bookend, and it also came with this fabulous other a piece called Dr. Vernola in this case. That is to say, she's a teacher, a distinguished lecturer in our department, and also in charge of organizing these on an annual basis. So it takes a special talent to be able to do both those things. We did a national search for her, and she came up on top. So I want to welcome her, because we haven't done that formally yet, and thank you. Thank you. Thanks also to Dr. Mikhail Dolbilov for serving on that search committee, and for his participation in conceptualizing the residency program. And finally here, I'd like to thank and say a word of appreciation to Dr. Loretta Lau for her innumerable contributions, sitting modestly in the middle row there, toward the rolling out of the Maya Brin lectureship in the residency program. So I hope that today's discussions will spark new ideas and perspectives and provoke spirited debate. And once again, I thank all our distinguished participants for coming. So please join me in welcoming Dmitry Biokov to our campus for this wonderful series of events. Do you want to speak from here, or do you want to speak from there?
Well, I'll try to say some words. Thank you, dear friends. First of all, I must say that all this symposium and all this talk and all those good words told about me seemed to me a cruel joke from my literary enemies, who decided to make such a great phony for me to believe it. Because it's really unbelievable for me, who is in the habit of listening quite in other words in Russian. It's natural for me to become an enemy, because I'm trying to express things which are really important for me, and now in Russia it's not very important. You must say something which is waited for you, from you. So I have the reputation of enfant terrible, which is really very funny, being such a 46-year enfant, not très terrible, I should say. But nevertheless, it's really very pleasant to listen that you are interested in Soviet literature and Soviet life, which is my main topic. I'm quite sure that the Soviet period was the highest, the most interesting top in all Russian history. Maybe because Russia could influence the world only during this period. All the rest time, it was just a small part of it, or maybe alternative to it. But during Soviet period, Russia was one of the main players in the world game. Now, when Vladimir Putin is called by Forbes the most influencing person all over the world, Barack Obama is the second, my congrats. So now we can see that truly he doesn't influence even his own country, not the world also. He doesn't influence it really because Pasternak said that true governing is governing by ideas, not by human masses. Он управлял течением мыслей и только потому страной. So I think that only intellectuals can influence somehow the future of the world. And intellectualism is something that is really harmful for nowadays Russia. It's dangerous for it. Like, for example, too big speed is dangerous for an old train. Now Russia is a kind of old train which can't move faster because maybe it would lose all its carriages in such speed. So we're trying to be grey, to be medium, to be neutral, because being on top of intellectuality means to destroy this convention of I don't know how to translate посредственность, но вы меня поймете. Let us call it this way. So I think it's rather important here to understand, to recall, to analyze the Soviet experience, because it was the time of huge people and huge ideas. It was the continuation of the tradition of enlightenment, which is now blamed in Europe, but which was necessary for Russia to grow up into 10 or 12 or 20 years and to become truly influencing, to become the real player in all the world game. Russia had to become quick and mobilized. I understand very well that Stalin's experience is a huge psychological trauma, but we need to understand that Stalin didn't accumulate Russian history. He wanted to enslave it, nevertheless. It was a reaction on Lenin's progressive idea. I understand that Lenin seems funny and naive and cruel, but we must understand that Lenin was maybe the best fruit of all the development of Russian idea, of Russian national idea. And maybe Lenin's plans are the most needed plans now, because we know revolution is dangerous, but being dull and rotten is more dangerous for the great country. Fire can keep something, and the swamp can't keep anything. Everything will die. That's my strange position, you know it. I'm very happy that here I can tell about it without any danger, and nobody will call me the advocate of devil. So thank you so much, and I hope that our discussion will be really cruel, dangerous, and interesting, like everything in the Soviet Union.
I'm just going to, before I introduce Professor Michael David Fox, I just wanted to say something about the format of this roundtable. What we're thinking about is just having 4 presentations, one after the other, and then have a discussion. And I can serve as the moderator, and we can do what I think of as the history model, where people catch my eye, and I'll write down your name, and then because I assume there'll be many people who want to talk all at once, and then I'll call on you as it comes time for the next person to talk. So we'll just have the presentations one after the other now, and the first one is going to be Professor Michael David Fox, my former colleague here at Maryland. I won't make a joke about how he's an immigrant, but he's professor of history and a historian of modern Russian and Soviet history. He's published widely on the political, cultural, and intellectual history of late Imperial Russia and the Soviet Union. His most recent book, showcasing the great experience, cultural diplomacy in Western visitors to the Soviet Union, 1921 to 1941, from Oxford University Press, is a major work that's already major, a very important book. He has a new book that he's been working on, which I'm going to read the title, Crossing Borders, Modernity, Ideology, and Culture in Soviet Russia. He's working on the history of Nazi occupation of the USSR during World War II, and the history of Stalinism and German occupational rule in the region of Smolensk. Of course, many of us also know him as one of the founding editors of an incredibly influential journal for Russian and Soviet history, Kritika, and as such, I think he's been extremely influential in our field, and he's a wonderful colleague, whether he's here or whether he's across the district. Please welcome Professor David Fox.
Thanks, Liz. Coming back here to College Park is almost enough to make me nostalgic too. I share Dmitry Blyukov's interest and enthusiasm for studying the Soviet period. In fact, I've devoted much of my life to that and to the study of the Russian and Soviet intelligentsia. But in these remarks, I actually find myself returning to the pre-Soviet period and to a certain, something that Dmitry Blyukov has also written about in some of his writings, the cyclical character of Russian history. And for me, the shift from the 1990s to the 2000s and the period that we're living in today, as a historian, this fits in with almost perfect logic into the certain cyclical patterns of the Russian historical process. Periods of reaction and reform, openings and closings, crackdown and thaw, flux and consolidation. These were part not only of the Soviet period, but of Russian imperial history from arguably the 18th century on. And it's not just that the failures of attempted reform, in the case of the 1990s, the now much reviled Yeltsin period, led to some sort of renewed stress on statism and some sort of vigilance constructed in response to the previous period. It's that the period surrounding the collapse of the Soviet Union whatever one thinks of it now, was one of the most pro-Western periods in Russian history. And then this was followed by a kind of prickly, nationalistic, and episodically anti-Western, although still in many ways quite open, and there's certain anomalies to the current period, but this is the political tactics of Putinism. So when you look back at the Russian historical process, you see that periods of defeat in international competition, or periods of modernizing reconstruction, such as the great reforms of the mid-19th century, the Khrushchev thaw, or the early 1990s, have generally made the forces that are especially receptive to outside borrowing or accommodation come to the fore, whereas the internal agenda of strengthening what is now known as the power vertical comes with its own international ramifications of greater hostility, if only in political and ideological terms, with the West. This is what I call the internal-external nexus. Dmitry Lvovich has noted in some of his writings that it's difficult to talk only about the Soviet legacy without also talking about a much older Russian legacy as well. But as I've been talking, you can't hear the quotation marks that I'm putting around the term the West. As I often tell my Russian friends, particularly if I want to get into a very good conversation around the kitchen table for 3 or 4 hours or so, the West does not exist. At least as a single unified entity, it's a myth, created differently over time out of many different historical trajectories. The myth was created here, but also, more to the point, in Russia as well. So, you know, if you see, for example, England and the United States as being quite different in their historical trajectories as the European continent, if you see Germany's path, of course, leading through National Socialism, then one is perhaps left with the West as maybe France and the Benelux countries. As my former colleague here, Don Sutherland, in French history used to say, you know, since the French provinces are so different from Paris, then maybe the West only exists somewhere on the Bois de Boulogne. But of course, France was anomalous and not paradigmatic itself in many ways. But from the perspective of, say, Catherinian or Soviet Russia, the distance was great enough that multiple models and paths were less apparent than unity. So from the time the West emerged as a concept, which was either sometime in the late 18th century or the 19th century, depending on whether one believes Larry Wolff or his critics, but it had a life of its own, this concept. This doesn't disguise the historical fact that discrete interactions and selective borrowings by Russia, you can trace this back all the way to, say, borrowings from, say, Catholic Russia via Kiev in the 17th century, or from Northern Europe in Peter the Great's reorientation, or Central Europe and Germany in much of the 18th and 19th century, that those specific interactions should not be distinguished. It was only during the superpower rivalry, of course, that the United States became the main referent. But so to sum it up, when we talk about Russia and the West, it's useful to think about historical and ideological factors. The two, of course, were intertwined, but in my remarks here, I'm going to, for clarity and analytical purposes, separate the two out. So sort of in this little talk, history will be the appetizer and ideology will be the dessert. I'll leave it to Dmitry Blikov to provide the vторое блюдо, the main course. The legendary historian of Russia, Al Rieber, who happens to be, I can't resist saying, giving the inaugural Richard Stites lecture at Georgetown a week from yesterday. I left a bunch of these flyers out over there. He talks about persistent factors in Russian history that stretch across the imperial and Soviet periods. These are dilemmas that all regimes, Tsarist and Soviet, or the provisional government for that matter, no matter how different they were, they had to confront these certain persistent factors or dilemmas. he talks about them as persistent precisely to get away from single, fixed, unchanging, essential features. Those kinds of features that have been mythologized to explain all of Russian history, such as Oriental despotism in the 19th century. One could come up with a whole list of these things. The search for a warm water port was very popular at one point in the Cold War. Some of Reber's persistent factors are geographical, porous frontiers. Others were economic, relative backwardness vis-a-vis the leading industrialized powers. Others had to do with the fact of empire, the multinational state. Others were cultural, and in fact, Reber talks about cultural alienation as one of these persistent factors. He defines this as all those reasons why Russians and foreigners alike see Russia as a place distinct from Europe and the West. I'm not entirely happy with that term, cultural alienation. Maybe cultural distinctiveness would be better. But all of those persistent factors are, to some degree or another, still present today. But I want to just point out how they are interconnected with the cyclical features of Russian history that I referred to. In historical explanations, backwardness is often very much exaggerated in our historiographical tradition, but if we think of the need to keep up with great power rivals who possessed greater resources, that is, we talk about not of backwardness, but relative backwardness, say, then the persistent imperative for state-sponsored, modernizing reforms that would by necessity import expertise and innovation from points west, that becomes very intelligible. And certainly the economic collapse accompanying the Soviet implosion of 1991 made this imperative appear even more acute than, say, defeat in the Crimean War in 1855. But then you have these statist programs of top-down modernization, and given all the problems connected to lack of cohesion that relate to the other persistent factors, this has consistently led to either problems or failure, which serves to discredit the international borrowings and openings. Forces that believe in harder lines come to the fore, whether it's the Polizeistaat model, the police state model of the 19th century, or, and here I feel the need to invoke Marx's dictum from the 18th of Brumaire, that it's the first time as tragedy and the second time as farce, but the Putin power vertical would say fit into that tradition. Now, of course, cyclical patterns don't mean that history repeats itself. Not at all. That's each cycle is actually very different and provides a lot of interesting work needs to be done on how these cycles themselves change. For example, there hasn't been the kind of international closing off of Russia that we've seen in some of the earlier cycles. But there's also a huge number of factors that affect the outcomes of these things, and many changes and reversals occur within each phase, and competing agendas are always present in each of the eras. Now, in some ways, the 2.5 decades of the Stalin period encompass are an anomaly. They had their own mini-cycles in some ways, but the whole experience, because of the revolutionary statist drive, it was unprecedented and unrepeated. But one of my points is that we Russian historians looking at post-Soviet Russia now have a very reconfigured terrain to look at continuities and discontinuities in the Russian historical process. Now, before we had both sides of 1917, now we also have both sides of 1991. And I say this in part to make an analogy with some of the really probing historical reflections that you've seen in the German field. Pretty much every great German historian has to meditate on continuities across these great changes of regime, such as 1918, 1933, 1945, 1989. So, now for the ideological Nachspeise. The debate about Russia and the West was, as you all know, deeply embedded in the debates about national identity in the 19th century. And those debates, the Slavophile, Westernizer, split, but that's a shorthand for many complicated developments. But those had also reverberations, reconfigurations, recapitulations. For example, in the debate between populism and Marxism in the late 19th century, the split in the early Soviet period between, say, to also make a crude oversimplification, internationalism versus autarkic vigilance in the early Soviet years. Or you could draw it much later, the division between Sakharov and Solzhenitsyn in the dissident movement, and so on and so forth. This intellectual legacy of the debates about Russia and the West is already so weighty that one is tempted to ascribe it the status of a persistent factor itself. But it's worth asking, and this is where I'll just pause to make one last point, is that how the Soviet period altered the old debates about Russia and the West. And I would point to several developments. First, the old choice between following the West or following a unique path was after 1917 reconfigured to be a choice between capitalism and communism, and thus the political stakes and the confrontation were greatly heightened in the Soviet period. Second, the Stalinist declaration of superiority over the West. This is something that really happened especially in the latter half of the 30s and especially in the late 1940s. But that claim that everything Soviet was superior was unprecedented in its totality and its scope. I've called this the Stalinist superiority complex to refer not just to the psychological complex, but to the military-industrial complex because it was so institutionalized. And it left a deep legacy. For example, the overconfidence of the Khrushchev-era reformers in their openings to the outside world and their embrace of competition with the USA was, I think, to a certain extent fueled by the still present superiority complex that they grew up with. Another final point is that the Stalin-era incorporation of elements of Russian nationalism, which David Brandenburger here has written about. This was also a phenomenon that really got underway, especially in the late 1930s, but even more so during the war and after, was a legacy that spilled over into the post-Soviet era. The Russian historian Nikolai Mitrokhin, who's now based in Bremen, wrote a really interesting book called Ruskaya Partия, which the Russian party, about groupings of conservative nationalist sentiment that arose specifically in the post-war Stalin era as factions within the Soviet Central Committee and the Komsomol. These so-called patriotic political ideological factions took and adapted certain tenets of their beliefs almost directly from pre-revolutionary traditions of Russian nationalism. Their heirs suffered really big defeats during perestroika and the early 1990s. But by the same token, the discrediting of the 1990s in Russia should not only be seen as a popular reaction to the widespread economic instability and devastation of that decade, which is of course important, but it was also a well-conditioned and a deep-seated political and ideological shift to a long-standing alternative platform, speaking in very broad terms, of course. And I'll close by mentioning one recent discussion in the contemporary Russian discussion of Stalinism. It's something that's very popular and widespread argument in the blogosphere, that the crimes of Stalinism, of course, were bad, but all modernizing countries engaged in terrible violence. The United States annihilated the Native Americans and so on. The argument is convincing in part because it's to a large degree true. Liberal modernity, Western imperialism, et cetera, involved very grave mass atrocities that often simply get ignored in discussions about, the political system in Russia. However, even leaving aside the questions of scale and scope of these atrocities, I want to call attention to certain features of this new argument that modernization always leads to excesses. That in light of the older arguments about Russia and the West. First of all, it's a relativizing argument, right? It means that This depiction of Stalin's violence allows the political violence of Stalinism to be regretted, to be condemned, rather than defended, but it portrays it as virtually inevitable. It also serves, and I think this is important in terms of what I've been speaking about, this argument that all modernization, including Stalinism, leads to excesses. It serves to break down the old notions of assertions of superiority emanating from the West. And finally, most interesting of all, it now relies on a universalistic notion of modernization, rather than, say, positing a sharply different path for Russia, for different Western countries, or for the West as a whole, or for what historians might now call multiple modernities. And this highly universalistic understanding of modernization is something that was greatly reinforced by the Marxism-Leninism of the Soviet period, and it itself can be considered a significant legacy of the Soviet period. Okay, that's all. Thank you.
Okay, so the next speaker is my colleague at the University of Maryland, the head of the history department, Sarah Cameron. She's an historian of Russia and the Soviet Union with a particular research interest in societies and cultures of Central Asia. Her book, Manuscript in Progress, The Hungry Steppe, Famine, Mass Violence, and the Making of Soviet Kazakhstan, examines a little-known episode of Stalinist modernization, the Kazakh famine of 1930 to 33. She received her PhD in 2010 from Yale University, where her dissertation won the John Addison Porter Prize for Best Dissertation in the Arts and Sciences, and the Turner Prize for Most Outstanding Dissertation in European History. And I think she's just back from Astana, Kazakhstan also. Yeah. So please welcome Sarah.
Thank you, Liz, for that very kind introduction. I'll be speaking today about the Soviet legacy in Kazakhstan. Kazakhstan is the largest of the former Soviet republics, with the exception of Russia. Today it shares a very long border with Russia, also a border with China. The majority population are Kazakhs who are Muslims, they're Turkic speakers. But Kazakhstan, of course, also has a significant Russian and Ukrainian minority. And it is, of course, also a place very dramatically transformed by the population politics of the Soviet regime. Before I get into the specifics of this particular case, the Kazakh case, I wanted to raise a broader question, which is why consider cases outside of Russia? Why look at the borderland or the outposts of the Soviet Empire? Why are they actually helpful and useful to us in terms of thinking about the Soviet legacy in Russia? I would argue that if we look more broadly and comparatively, then it reveals a great deal about the Soviet legacy. One very obvious question is why we see such heterogeneity amongst the post-Soviet states in regards to the Soviet legacy. If they all experienced the system, then why and how did such striking differences among these states emerge? Then, if one wants to make the claim that certain features are a result of the Soviet system, then theoretically all places that experience the Soviet system should give rise to the same outcomes. However, of course, we know that this isn't the case. So we, of course, have to look towards other factors that explain this heterogeneity, the Soviet system and another factor that might explain it. So today I'll be talking about one aspect of this question, and that is why the Soviet Union is remembered so differently in different places. I'll look particularly at the way contemporary Kazakhstan has dealt with its Soviet past. And I hope and I think the comparison with Russia or with other places will come out in discussion. In the early 1990s, soon after Kazakhstan's independence, local historians, quote unquote, discovered some of the legacies of the Soviet past. There was an outpouring of interest in a number of topics, particularly the Kazakh famine of 1930 to 33. This is the subject of my own research. And for those of you who don't know it, this particular disaster, it dramatically transformed Kazakhstan at the time. Perhaps 1.5 million people perished. And the burden of this particular disaster fell predominantly on ethnic Kazakhs. and something along the lines of 1/3 of all Kazakhs perished in this disaster. It's a very hot and button issue, and of course, it bears certain similarities to a much more famous case, the Ukrainian famine. But this was a really fundamental episode in the making of Soviet Kazakhstan, and also in understanding the nature of Soviet rule in this particular territory. In the early 1990s, Kazakhstan assembled a presidential commission to investigate the disaster, and there was really a total explosion of discussion of this particular topic across the popular and scholarly media. And this presidential commission, which was ordered by Nazarbayev, found that this disaster was a genocide. By the late 1990s, however, discussion on the topic was really silenced. Local historians really told me that they had been specifically encouraged to do not work on this topic. They had started work on other topics themselves. And in particular, in their advice to me as an American historian studying this problem, they said, well, that's very nice, but we've really solved all those questions. And in fact, there were a number of memorials to the famine itself, which were literally half built. They just stopped construction. And I would argue that this, in particular, is also representative of the way the Soviet past more generally was treated in Kazakhstan, that really there were very few local historians who were working seriously actually on the topic of the Soviet past. If they did so, it was on very, very limited topics, such as the question of the Kazakh intelligentsia. But actually, I would argue in 2012, the situation changed actually yet again. In 2012, Kazakhstan's president, Nursultan Nazarbayev, declared that this year, the country would actually commemorate the 80th anniversary of the Kazakh famine. There was a huge rush to construct new monuments to the famine, to dig up specialists on the Kazakh famine. It was a very, very interesting episode, and I participated in a conference there on it. Nazarbayev at this point mentioned his desire that the famine be discussed again in Kazakhstan. He declared that we have been wrong, to not discuss this disaster, and he declared that there was a need to remember it. Notably, however, in referring to the disaster, he refrained from using the word genocide. Again, this was a word that had been such a hallmark of the discussions of the early 1990s, and he cautioned people against politicizing the disaster. He said, all right, we need to remember it, but we should refrain from politicizing it. And Nazarbayev's directives have changed the situation again. I was in Astana about 10 days ago for a conference, and I was struck actually by how much interest there was in the Soviet period on the part of Kazakh historians. Most notably, several very, very influential historians in Kazakhstan have actually changed their views of the disaster. These were some of the people who claimed very vehemently that it was a genocide in the early 1990s. They were largely silent in the intervening years, and they are now once again very vocally discussing the disaster, but they have changed their tune. And they no longer argue that it's a genocide. As well, there are other really interesting changes at work in Kazakhstan. First is the construction of Nazarbayev University, a very new Western-style university in Astana. It's funded, of course, as you might guess, by the president himself. And all the courses are in English, but all the students are actually required to take a course on the history of Kazakhstan. And Nazarbayev University has been very active in hiring people with foreign PhDs. What is also interesting is that when these faculty teach the history of Kazakhstan, they actually have an exemption from the dispensation to teach Kazakh history according to the state curriculum. So there's a specific state curriculum on the teaching of Kazakh history, one in which Nazarbayev himself figures quite prominently, but the Nazarbayev University faculty, however, can teach this required course in whatever manner they want. And again, this is in a university bearing the president's name. Another interesting point also is that Kazakhstan and the US recently signed a new bilateral visa agreement As an American scholar, I was actually able to get a 5-year multi-entry visa to Kazakhstan, so also another very interesting development. So that brings me back to my first question. What are the factors here? How can we explain that the situation in Kazakhstan is not really moving in the same direction as Russia? I can offer up some sort of speculation and analysis of it. That perhaps it's moving away from the direction of Russia quite slowly. In part, this is because the economy in Kazakhstan has done quite well. Kazakhstan has a lot of oil, it's been quite assertive, and it is becoming more assertive on the international stage. But on the other hand, we can also see that they don't want to sour relations with Russia or with China. That there's also some continuity, there's some of the same people in power. Nazarbayev himself, of course, is an influential player from the Soviet period. And the third factor I think I would also identify is in Kazakhstan, I would say there is a great deal of ambivalence about the Soviet past. When I spoke to many local historians, they would tell me, look, we were nomads before. With the Soviet period, with Soviet modernization, we became a modern country. And this was something that was mentioned to me very frequently in my discussions with them. So to come back to the question, Kazakhstan, of course, has a Soviet legacy, but it is behaving very differently than Russia, that it is moving in a different direction. This is a really important question to think about, that of course there must also be other factors that play a role if the Soviet legacy has such very different outcomes in different places. Thank you.
I'd like to introduce my colleague from the Women's Studies Department, Catherine Schuler. She's an associate professor of women's studies. Her research focuses on gender in Russian theater, performance and culture of the theatrical art, and gender and performance. Professor Schuler is the editor of Theater Journal, the leading peer-reviewed journal of theater studies in the U.S. She's the author of Theater and Identity in Imperial Russia, Women in Russian Theater, the Actress and the Silver Age, co-editor of Theater and Feminist Aesthetics, along with numerous peer-reviewed articles and book reviews. She's currently working on a project about theatricality in post-Soviet Russia.
Okay, so we moved from Marx's first act is tragedy to second act is farce. And so I'll be talking about the farce. Let me say first of all that my costume here, of course, it's the day after Halloween, and so I wanted to make certain that I was appropriately dressed. But I also wanted to wear, I only get to wear this when I talk about food. And for me, this in a certain way embodies Putin-esque theatricality and also the, I think, post-Soviet neoliberalism as it has manifested in the Sochi Olympics. And I'm also hoping, because I hope to write about the Sochi Olympics, that if any of you know a cheaper way to get there than through the official website, please let me know. That's quite a ripoff. Okay, so I am a historian of imperial theater, like Liz said, and this is quite a switch for me to start talking about Putin and theatricality. I became interested in this topic back in 2004 when, by happenstance, I was in the Bolshoi Theater for an avant-garde production of Romeo and Juliet, and there was Mr. Putin and his now ex-wife, or soon-to-be ex-wife, sitting in the Tsar's box about, maybe 20 feet from me. And I had never been interested in Putin, or really in any post-Soviet leader, except insofar as he affected my access to archives. So this got me interested in Putin, and I've done quite a lot of work on him. Now I want to say what I'm going to talk about today, I just finished a much longer article on this topic, and cutting it down to 10 minutes was really quite a job. And so I'd be happy to answer any sorts of questions that you might have. And probably in the longer article, there's much more about intersections between Soviet and post-Soviet. So all of those things said, let me begin. So I am going to talk about Razgovor s Vladimirom Putinim, performing democracy Putin style. And I want to start with a quote from Larry King. Vladimir Putin, if he were an American, would be a successful American politician. He has a quality. This has nothing to do with politics. They change a room. They have certain magnetism. He has it. Whatever it is, he has it. A forum entitled The Kremlin's Theater of the Absurd appeared in December 2011 on the Etc., an internet site maintained by Russian emigres. Calling itself Putin's political theater, The Longest Post uses the language of theater and performance ironically to describe cyclical regime change in Russia and to name Vladimir Putin's presidency for what it seems to critics in Russia and the West to be. A 13-year sequence of loosely related production numbers designed to conceal grubby backstage operations in the Kremlin. A staple of Russian political history from Peter I through Stalin, the theatrical metaphor has revived under Putin, an actor-politician with rare and largely unforeseen gifts for stagecraft and statecraft. The most brazen and amusing examples of Putin-esque theatricality are universally notorious: bare-chested mountain man, virile vampire, guardian of endangered species, NASCAR driver, surrogate parent of orphaned Siberian cranes, and so on. Photographic evidence indicates that far from Marcia Gessen's man with no face, Putin is a man with a surfeit of faces, in point of fact, an actor. Indeed, pumped up on performance-enhancing endorphins, this human bricolage of imperial, post-Soviet, Soviet, post-socialist, and postmodern identities takes stage like a seasoned professional. Critics contend that PR-driven theatricality emerged early in Putin's first term, but the most amusing and obviously theatrical self-reinventions appeared rather suddenly after the 2008 election, and many can be traced to US and European public relations firms hired by the Kremlin to rebrand Russia in order to better sell her at home and abroad. Each year since 2008, Putin theatricals have changed in quality, kind, and scale of fabulousness. But so antithetical are most of them to the values and principles promulgated over 74 years by the Soviets that they cause one to wonder what the president and his PR handlers hoped to accomplish and whether they overestimated their audience's tolerance for political theater. Although Putin's stunts remain noteworthy for their silliness, critics have already deflated most of them. A more provocative genre is the Putin Live Q&A, a peculiar hybrid of Soviet and post-Soviet political performance practice that has received only passing attention in the West, but might usefully be understood as a performance of democracy. Now, before you laugh, let me offer two disclaimers here. Democracy, as it's understood in the US and in much of Europe, does not figure here, nor does performing democracy as a sort of grassroots community-based theater practice intended to raise a disenfranchised citizenry's consciousness in the interests of social change. Just as Putin claims that managed democracy is still democracy, I claim that a quasi-authoritarian show business president was able to perform a semblance of democracy, but played well for many years in the newly neoliberal post-Soviet Russia. The success of this project relied on an unsophisticated public, the Kremlin's exclusive rights to Russian language television, a dynamic PR team, an ex-theater director on staff, and Putin himself, an actor-politician whose instinct for performance and knack for sincerity of tone and gesture rivals Ronald Reagan's. The phenomenon that I call performance of democracy manifests in a uniquely post-Soviet infotainment event variously called Direct Line with Vladimir Putin and Conversation with Vladimir Putin, depending on what year we're in. Unlike Putin's transparently theatrical PR stunts, This annual event exemplifies the Kremlin's quest to perform democracy without actually implementing it in post-Soviet and post-Yeltsin Russia. And if you believe, as I do, that performance is a way of knowing, the significance of the direct line should be obvious. Extending from 2001 to 2013, these productions constitute a visual and verbal record of the expansion of Putin's image from modest ex-KGB operative into actor, politician, and media hero. Perhaps more importantly, the transformation of the direct line from a comparatively simple Q&A between electorate and elected leader into, supposedly elected leader, into an infotainment spectacular starring the show business president may be seen to mirror the fortunes of democracy itself in Putin's Russia. Now, a 10-minute presentation cannot do justice to the 11 iterations of the direct line over 12 years, and my severely abbreviated conclusion is particularly mortifying in this company. I can only sketch key features of the early performances, which would be 2001 to 2007, and the late ones, 2008 to 2013, in order to suggest the trajectory of a seemingly democratic event that may, in its first iterations, have been motivated by a smidgen of authentic democratic feeling, but that began a transformation from seeming to simulacrum after the 2008 elections. Recall for a moment, and this is where I wish I had slides, recall for a moment, probably all of you can imagine this very easily, the anti-telegenic qualities of late Soviet theater, or probably leaders, and the seductive quality of the first direct lines becomes immediately apparent. Two attractive young journalists, one male, one female, sit with a youngish Putin in a nondescript Kremlin conference room for more than 2 hours, asking and fielding questions. Direct telephone and internet connections allow regular Ivans and Mashes in cities across the nation to quiz the new president. Although questions are vetted well in advance of the live event, an off-site call center provides a feeling of spontaneity and authenticity. Accompanied by patriotic music, the image of a satellite in motion opens the broadcast, while video of snowy Kremlin towers and the sound of Kremlin chimes conduct viewers to the performance site. The telegenic anchors dress modestly in gray suits. Putin's entrance from behind a screen is underwhelming, and the three sit rather stiffly around a conference table. In conventionally Soviet fashion, Putin responds to questions about dire social and economic conditions with mind-numbing statistics. But unlike his Soviet predecessors, he also interacts unaffectedly with the folk who call or appear on a large screen located at the other end of the conference room. And therein, I think, lies the performance's magic, if it can be called that. Now, the finale consists of a barrage of tough questions, many of them surprisingly sweet and personal, selected before the broadcast for their obvious emotional appeal. Periodic cuts to off-site locations provide some relief from talking heads and visual monotony, but there is neither dramatic tension nor obvious theatricality. Why then did the first direct line enjoy a 75.3% of audience share in 2001? Well, it was down to a still enviable 66.3% in 2007. Three things stand out for me. Its creation of a convincing illusion of participatory democracy, ostensible transparency, and Putin's remarkable performance. Although initially wooden, he warmed to his task, appearing frank, honest, open, spontaneous, intelligent, sober, and sincerely concerned for the well-being of pensioners literally begging him for help. He answered questions eagerly, explained at length, and like a good father, son, brother, or husband, often promised to intervene personally to resolve their problems. In contrast to his Soviet predecessors, Putin felt human, and this performance is all about feeling. He smiled shyly, flashed his endearing dimples to the television audience, and occasionally inserted moments of humor into an otherwise serious conversation. This production style played well enough to be repeated in much the same format through 2007. Not surprisingly, in 2008, a year marked by Putin's demotion to prime minister, the direct line changed dramatically. From opening images and music to rearrangement of the physical space to introduction of a live studio audience, the event was suddenly transformed from a modest conversation with the nation's leader into a spectacular, high-tech, postmodern town hall meeting. A television studio arranged with a central playing area and steeply raked auditorium replaced the Kremlin boardroom. A soft pink cyclorama sparkled behind Starship Enterprise scenery, and high-tech props, while smoking hot women worked busily at computer stations designed to match the set in form and color. Smartly dressed star-quality anchors sat or stood in a space designed to amplify Putin's presence. Striding along a hallway, he entered the space, mounted the steps of the raised circular platform, and shook hands firmly with the male anchor before sitting confidently at the very center of the stage. A rapt studio audience, by 2011 awash with celebrities, applauded his best lines while roving cameras provided visual variety. Off-location sites remained central, but the number shrank to 5, and they were used for dramatic punctuation and effect through display of monumental construction, industrial, and military projects. Marking a new emphasis on story, character, and aesthetics, dramatic national narrative and highly produced theatrical spectacle replaced the easy intimacy of the earlier chats. The dramatic structure was tightened, characters were more clearly delineated, slick off-site scenarios lost all sense of spontaneity, and forced dynamism drove dramatic tension skywards. In a setting and manner designed to inspire trust and impart gentle paternalistic authority, Putin spun and sold a narrative of Russian democracy, meaning Soviet sovereign democracy managed vertically by a wise, charismatic ruler who is cosmopolitan, confident, and competent, stylish and sober, and very, very smart. This format obtained through the post-election production of April 2013. Now, actually, my article is mostly about the 2013 production, which I describe in great detail, and I'm sorry that I can't do that there because it really was quite an interesting experience. But at any rate, that's for another time. So each year witnessed a more fabulous mise-en-scène, a more carefully choreographed montage of images, and a more obviously contrived plot. Despite early signs of its long-term viability, evidence began to accumulate as early as 2008 that the Direct Line had already lost considerable audience share, perhaps owing to cognitive dissonance as the gap between word and deed grew larger. Paradoxically, increased theatricality seemed to alienate Putin's audience. A survey of audience share for Conversations in Direct Lines produced between 2001 and 2013 indicates that dropping percentages and increased theatricality seemed to correlate inversely. In other words, the more theatrical the Direct Line became, the more questionable its truth value. By 2012, many Russians were sick of Putin's show, quote, and called for him to stop the performance and start governing the nation. Perhaps motivated by low ratings, the Kremlin recently called off further production of the Direct Line with Vladimir Putin. An extended press conference will replace this most visually and verbally effective semblance of democracy. If the Direct Line was intended to present an image of the Putin regime's openness, what does its absence signify for the future of Putin's Russia? Will the performance of democracy take another form, or does the demise of the Direct Line mark the collapse of even the illusion of democracy?
One question, please.
Pardon me?
Well, yeah, I'm sorry. How can you explain the theatrical tradition of Putin? Who is his predecessor in this style?
Well,
And of Russian directors and so on.
Russian directors. Well, I think there are a couple of things going on here, and I'm not sure that I believe that Russian directors are the most influential on this style. And I think Putin, when he went to the United States in 2000 or 2001, it was before the first Direct Line. He was on Larry King Live. He did an interview on the BBC and on NPR. And the feedback he got was apparently quite positive, right? And I think it's no mistake then that, or no coincidence that the Direct Line started very soon after that. So I would say that that influence is really pretty great. But maybe you can tell me what you think the Russian theatrical influence is on
I think
this.
Yuri Lyubimov was, because his duty
Okay.
was to look at him in 70s, because KGB was really attractive for Lyubimov's plays. And so this aesthetics, maybe Brecht's aesthetics of direct contact with the audience, yes, was just Lyubimov's, because the aesthetic of parody is quite evident in Putin's people. Thank you so much. Yes, thank you. Okay.
Okay, so our fourth presentation and last one for the morning, and then we'll have an open discussion. Is David Brandenburger. He's an associate professor of history and international studies at the University of Richmond. His research has focused on Stalin-era propaganda, ideology, and nationalism. He's the author of National Bolshevism, Stalinist Mass Culture, and the Formation of Modern Russian National Identity, 1931 to 1956, published by Harvard. Propaganda, State in Crisis, Soviet Ideology, Indoctrination, and Terror under Stalin from 1928 to 1941. He's also co-editor with Kevin Platt of Epic Revisionism, Russian History and Literature as Stalinist Propaganda, along with many essays and articles in prominent journals. At present, Professor Brandenburger is preparing a critical edition of Stalin's infamous party history textbook, The Short Course on History of the Communist Party of the Soviet Union, for Yale University Press. And I think Professor Brandenburger is going to be talking to us today about textbooks.
It's the 75th anniversary of the Krakow course, and maybe
The short course.
the short course, right? I hope it's a historical accident that there's a new campaign underway in Moscow to produce a new, stable, single textbook for the entire country, and that's what I'm going to talk about today. So my talk is entitled "Lessons for the Soviet Legacy," or "Lessons of the Soviet Legacy: A Bukovian Critique of Putin's Campaign for an Official Public School History Textbook." If the study of history in the public schools during the Soviet period was dominated by a single official line and a single history textbook, monolithic textbook, this gave way after 1991 to a much looser system in which a variety of ideologically diverse textbooks vied with one another for a share of the national market. Some 100 different texts were used in the public schools by the turn of the 21st century. But as the heterogeneity of this early Soviet period gave way after 2000 to consolidationist tendencies under Putin and Medvedev, talk turned again to the reestablishment of a single official line, a single official mobilizational account of the Russian Soviet past that was designed to foster a new, broadly felt sense of patriotism. In my comments today, I'll outline official efforts to create this new canonical view on the Soviet legacy, and then attempt, as arrogant as it sounds, to wager a Bukovian technique, Bukovian critique of this search for a useful past. Putin first spoke of the need for a new sense of historical perspective shortly after his inauguration in 2000, connecting the issue to the broader imperative of developing a single national idea to unify the country's fractious political system. In the wake of this announcement, a hodgepodge of deferential gestures to Soviet history began to make headlines. The revival of the Red Army battle flag, a sanitized version of the Stalin-era national anthem, the return of a bust of Dzerzhinsky to the militia headquarters in downtown Moscow, extensive state support and airtime for mass culture's normalization of the Soviet experience on television, and so on and so forth. Perhaps the most notorious example of this revivalism was Putin's announcement in his April 2005 State of the State message, in which he announced that, quote, the collapse of the USSR was the greatest geopolitical catastrophe of the 20th century. Many observers in the West and in Russia sneered at these sorts of statements and attributed, essentially wrote off Putin's rehabilitation of these symbols and rhetoric as a haphazard bricolage of populist nostalgia. Much more consistent, though, I think, have been campaigns which are much less well publicized to sponsor a new generation of history textbooks that would espouse a unified, patriotic national line on history. At least 2 attempts were made between 2002 and 2005 to create such a unified textbook, and when those failed, we saw in 2006 another attempt being made, which metastasized in 2007 and 2008 into the release of 2 major teacher's manuals by a brigade led by a non-professional named Filipov, and a whole array of connected curricular materials. Filipov's teacher's manuals gained notoriety in 2007 and 2008 almost immediately because of their apologetic approach to the Stalin period. What I found when I took a look at these materials myself was that overlooked at the press in the time, partly because of this frustration with the apologetic approach to Stalin, was a second major shortcoming of the texts. If the books were officially billed as a way of instilling patriotism in its readership, content analysis suggested that the texts were designed to do something entirely different. Instead of emphasizing conventional grassroots patriotism based on either an ethnic or a civic conception of national sovereignty, the text focuses instead on state power, centralization, and the construction of an administrative command system, the so-called vertical velocity. Public outcry over the Filipov texts and their associated curricular materials probably stood in the way of this becoming a monopolistic text in 2008, and so such did not come to pass, 5 years ago. That said, it's pretty clear when you look at the teacher's manuals and textbooks which are still in circulation today that they exercise a more subtle, indirect influence in streamlining the way that the text would be rewritten between 2008 and 2013. Now, 2012 was officially dubbed in Russia the Year of Russian History, and this set the stage for a resumption of the discussions concerning the role that the past was to play in contemporary Russian society. During Putin's campaign for his third presidential term, he resumed his criticism of existing public school history texts, and last year, or actually earlier this year in February, he announced that it was high time for a single official textbook to replace the array of rather compliant texts that already are in place in the public school system. This new textbook, according to Putin, should offer, quote, a single unified conception of Russian history, a singular logic, without internal contradictions or double meanings. Moreover, it was to be patriotic and to mobilize the Russian population around a dynamic, inspirational understanding of the national past. In the wake of Putin's announcement, a major campaign was launched under the personal direction of Sergei Naryshkin, Speaker of the Duma and Putin's former chief of staff. A working group of historians and bureaucrats was assembled, and 2 drafts of an official schema or outline of this new teacher's manual was developed. The first one was released in July and the second one in October. This schema outlined a new narrative for history, for the history in the public schools, and listed a whole series of key names, places, dates, and events that were to be included therein. A final version of this schema was released 2 days ago and sits right now on Putin's desk for his official approval. It's downloadable from the newly revised Russian Historical Society website. And this schema this year will create next year, will be the foundation next year for a competition to write the new unified history curriculum, which will be adopted according to at least to the timeline that's in place right now in 2015. So this new curriculum will become monopolistic and will absolutely dominate. It will replace everything in circulation today with a single unified curriculum of linked textbooks and materials. Now, following Putin's demand for a single unified conception without internal contradictions, when you look at these conceptions, the concepция, which is up on this website, when you look at the schema, you see that the new narrative is plotted along highly linear lines. Surprisingly liberal at first glance, it proposes to cultivate a sense of patriotism, citizenship, and inter-ethnic tolerance by paying attention to the tragedy of Russian history as well as its triumphalism. A closer look at this concepция, however, reveals much less liberal dimensions. Like the 2007 Filipov materials, the new narrative presents a version of the past that's designed to rally emotions around state rather than society. Successful historical governance is associated with the centralization of power and the maintenance of stability and order, rather than the promotion of social equality or civil society. Heroes are evaluated on the basis of their accomplishments rather than their methods. And if the schema makes regular mention of various periods' mistakes and shortcomings, all of this is framed within a teleological paradigm within which the end results always retroactively justify the means that were used to attain them. Indeed, it's a theme of tragic but indeed what you find here is really a theme of tragic but ultimately justifiable sacrifice, which is going to drive this new etatist emplotment. Aside from the teleology, though, the schema's emplotment presents other problems as well, particularly an overdeveloped, overdetermined narrative that subordinates every historical event and personage into its overall theme of centralization and order. This linear approach to history ultimately has the effect of reducing the past to a self-fulfilling prophecy, without the internal tension, contradictions, and dilemmas that provide the most heuristically valuable components of history education in the public schools. So it's an incredibly rigorous, strict, linear narrative without internal contradictions. Now, as I turn to our guest of honor for today, Dmitry Lvovich, I should concede that from the start that in print, Bykov has rarely, if ever, commented on history textbooks in public sphere, much less the ongoing reforms for the history curriculum. That said, he's written a lot of the past in general and the Soviet legacy in particular. I think it's fair to say that Bykov has very nuanced views of the Soviet past, being critical of the excesses of the Stalin years, but considerably more generous in regard to the period since 1953. For this, he's been criticized in print in absolutely savage terms, most famously by Mikhail Epstein and Valeria Novodvorskaya. Both of these critics are uncompromising in their condemnation of the Soviet past and pillory Bykov for his views. Epstein pays Bykov a backhanded compliment, describing him as bright and brilliant, but then proceeds to say that he has stunning blindness when it comes to the USSR. He diagnoses Bykov's myopia as tatalgia, a syndrome which is apparently derived from a nostalgic longing for totalitarianism. According to Epstein, in Bykov's blind, feverish tatalgia, he's missed the true narrative of Soviet society, and Epstein, of course, supplies us with that narrative. I'm quoting from him now, universal denunciation, enemies of the people, the terror, trials, trials, and more trials, class struggle, destruction of entire castes and ethnic groups, dekulakization, the impoverishment of the countryside, famine, the League of the Militant Godless, the Communist Party as the mind, dignity, and consciousness of the epoch, Pol Potism on a grand scale, the robbery, torture, and execution of tens of millions. So that's Epstein's interpretation. Novodvorskaya goes even further, if that's possible. She writes, Dmitry Bykov is in the camp of all the apologists of the USSR and Russia the Great. He stands alongside Nicholas I, the Bolsheviks, Mikhail Leontiev, Alexander Nevzorov, alongside the Mikhailkov family, as well as Putin and Lemonov. So it's pretty obvious that Epstein and Novodvorskaya here indulge in a lot of hyperbole, but I guess since we're discussing this at the roundtable today, we ought to ask the question as to whether there's any substance to these critiques. Does Bykov embrace an apologetic, linear narrative of the past? Is his version of the Soviet legacy similar to that which is being discussed in these history textbook committees in Moscow today to contribute to this new Единый учебник, this new standardized textbook? I think that Epstein and Novodvorskaya are stunningly wrong in their critique, and wrong on several fundamental levels. And I think this is actually rather interesting. In the most general of terms, Bykov, as I've already discussed, is critical of the Soviet past, particularly the Stalin period, which Epstein and Novodvorskaya focus on, and particularly Stalin, the terror, collectivization, and so on and so forth. But more importantly, Bykov is critical of all linear views of the past, no matter whether they're triumphalist or nihilist. Instead, he asserts the need to recognize the USSR as having multiple pasts. First, he sees these multiple pasts as a form of segmented periodization of the Soviet experience, a history with less continuity than with discontinuity. There is such a thing, writes Bykov, there is no such thing, writes Bykov, as a monolithic understanding of the Soviet Union. He continues and says, the Stalinist USSR, Khrushchevian USSR, and Brezhnevite USSR were all different states. Declaring one's love for France does not necessarily mean a love for the Vichy period nor the bloody reign of Robespierre. Loving France does not require you to rehabilitate the guillotine, nor require you to become a Pétainist collaborator. And he obviously holds the same position in regard to the Soviet legacy. Secondly, Bykov sees the Soviet experience as much more than just political history. For me, he writes, quote, the Soviet Union was the all-Russian reality of the time. Victory in 1945, space exploration, the Strugatsky brothers, Tarkovsky, Vysotsky, Pushkin, Rome, Sakharov, the 60s generation, Soviet dissidents, and even the most explicit examples of anti-Soviet activism. Solzhenitsyn, Shalamov, Bulgakov, Platonov, Grossman are all examples of Soviet culture, he writes. Bykov's notion of the Soviet legacy as being comprised of multiple pasts, a vision which embraces clashing values and contradictions, is far more subtle and nuanced than the singularly triumphalist, tatalgic linear narrative that Epstein and Novodvorskaya attribute to him. It's also superior and much more complex to the nihilistic linearity that Epstein and Novodvorskaya themselves embrace. But aside from Buykov's criticism of historical linearity, he's also skeptical of the instrumental approach to the Soviet legacy that either valorizes the past or condemns it in the name of political gain. This, I would argue, is important not just for polemics in the press, but extremely useful for the whole of Russian society today as it contemplates the idea of curricular reform. I'll conclude by quoting Buykov one more time on the subject of the Soviet legacy, where he writes, quote, "I think that today our relationship to the past should be as unemotional as possible. We should stop loving or hating Soviet power and instead try to extract from it some sort of a lesson."
Thanks for your time. It's a big pleasure. Thank you.
Do you want to respond first?
No. Thank you.
Okay,
Well, thank you all. That was really, wow, where to start? Well, I'll start actually with the end, right? Because I was wondering what you all make of the fact that this new textbook was proposed within the context of the Inter-Ethnic Council's 6-step plan to improve Russian culture, which I think is the more interesting thing about this textbook, which also brings forth the question, what do we do with this? Is this just a reflection of Russia adapting to the new normal? I was there in '96 for the Yeltsin elections, and it was really interesting how they quickly adapted a lot of the Western forms. I actually went to a rock concert in favor of Yeltsin, and just looking at that, and Putin's apparent really good vision of how he wants to define the process for defining Russian culture and Russian history. I think that's actually equally as interesting.
I thought it was, when David was talking about this, the new textbook came up in the 2013 direct line, right? And it came up immediately after the second off-site location was at a big World War II monument where World War II veterans were complaining about young hooligans urinating on monuments, right, and dancing half naked. I think sort of an allusion to Pussy Riot. But Putin introduced, when he first expressed his own outrage and then introduced this textbook, right, as this is what we need to do to bring post-Soviet youth back under control, right? They've lost their sense of history, they've lost their sense of our culture and respect for elders, and therefore we must have this new history book. And then he went into and I really support the full curriculum as well. And what has astonished me a little bit is I didn't realize this started back in 2000. That there have been various attempts to do it, but he was justifying it, at least publicly in this television spectacular, as this is the way we get hooligans under control once they appreciate our official version of history, which is the true version, right? Then this will play a difference.
That's definitely right. It's an integrative model rather than a Russian nationalist model. It was proposed in February of this year at a commission meeting on inter-ethnic affairs in the presence of anthropologists and other people concerned with these sorts of issues. It is a model which explicitly incorporates the non-Russian nationalities into the narrative in sort of a subordinate status. It's a centralizing narrative and therefore de facto a Russo-centric narrative, but I wouldn't say it's a Russian nationalist narrative. It's an étatist narrative. It's centralization most of all. It's statism, I think we're practicing.
I'm curious, when you said that the draft proposal that will be bid on, as I understood, is for a linked system of texts. Is that linked history text through K-12 or K-10? Or is it linked across disciplines like literature, any social science, economics?
It's a good question. It's not clear from the press what it's going to be. The press up through the summer of this year was talking about it being a single text. It looked an awful lot like the short course in 1938. And when there were some initial questions about it, the presidential administration dug in its heels and said, no, it's going to be a single text, a single text. I was able to talk to Valery Tishkov 2 weeks ago, who's on the commission, and he said, oh no, we're not going to pursue something like a single text. There will probably be linked texts for history courses, not across into other disciplines, but linked texts in history, appropriate for age level. His suspicion or his suggestion was, though he wouldn't really come out and say it, was that Tatarstan might be allowed to have its own edition with a little bit of local history as well. That there would be the central narrative, and that the various subjects of the Federation might be allowed to have variations, but it will be sort of plus minus 5% is what he was suggesting. But the key thing that Putin wanted back in 2000 and remains interested in 2013 is essential linear understanding that the hooligans can learn and presumably learn to love Mother Russia and to have something to talk about. They'll be able to all understand Nevsky the same way and Ivan the Terrible the same way, and this will presumably make them much more tolerant.
It's right, the hooligans are ripping the heart out of Mother Russia, and therefore they must be quite a picture.
Yeah, just kind of general comment. I've been listening to like 4 presentations on the questions that have been asked so far, and I'm really struck by the presence of this Soviet legacy in the sense that we are so much fascinated with a particular cult of personality. All the interpretations are top-down. We have almost no discussion about what is happening on the ground. And for instance, with this textbook, sure, like a lot of it is coming from Moscow, but if you put it in a slightly different perspective, namely, so for several years in a row, Russia has been trying to establish throughout its educational system the universal standardized test, right? Which requires a very particular sort of teaching material as well, right? You cannot teach the standard case like test, especially in Russia, where the test in itself is not separate from educational institutions, right? So then you have the really aging population of teachers. The majority of them have been trained during the Soviet period. So what do you do when you have this kind of situation on the ground? I'm sort of curious, like why the figure of Putin is so kind of dominant in our perception of Russian reality and Russian history. Like with your presentation, I was curious, does this theatricality actually work? Like if we ask people who watch or who participate, do they experience it in the same way as a scholar of theater would, right? Or something else is going on the ground? Because we know the Soviet public, Soviet audience was pretty skillful in reading between the lines. So how come that at this point in our sort of approach in history, we deny this skill to the Soviet audience, to post-Soviet audience?
Well, let me respond to that, because I do actually address that. And I think it's one of the reasons that you see the change from 75.3 approval rating, or 75.3% of audience share in 2001 and 49% in 2013, right? Is that I think, if anyone was at Maryland was at Clifford Gaddy's presentation, it's from the Brookings Institution last year, and he said that he didn't believe that Putin was a politician, right? And I was a little taken aback by that, because it seemed to me that Putin was very much a politician and an actor politician who fits a certain model in this country. What I've been looking into for the last several years is the development of a particular kind of political public relations theatricality that I think here in the United States we have grown very accustomed to, right? And that's why I named Reagan. You see, Reagan was the first one to have a PR office in the White House. And as far as I know, Putin is the first one to have a PR office in the Kremlin. And so it seemed to me that it took several years for Russian audiences to get accustomed not to the kind of cult of personality that we would associate with Stalin, but to the kind of actor-politician that was created through a PR apparatus that in many ways mirrors what the West does. I'm going to use the West in this very general way, right? Not meaning to do that. I'm thinking probably much more actually of the US model, because we have become, I think, masters of selling our politicians, right? Even if there's nothing there. And there's several, and again, I didn't mention this here, there's several critics of Putin's. Among them is his name, Gleb Pavlovsky, one of Putin's former PR managers, who said pretty much that Putin is complex, but finally he is kind of a blank screen, right? And that people project on him whatever they need to see, right? Now Putin himself, of course, says that no, there's no cult of personality around me. This is not happening. There's no apparatus by which to create this at this point. I do understand the problem, and I mentioned this in my text. The kind of performance that Putin does in the Direct Lines and the Razgovori is, in my view, very much a theater piece, right? When we have those here, whether they're town hall meetings or whatever form they take, you can actually get reviews of them, as in a theater production, right? The next day NPR reviews them, or you get a review in the Washington Post or the New York Times about the sort of success of the performance. I don't find that. I've been through the Levada Center and Novaya Gazeta.
Blogs.
Pardon me?
Blogs.
Blogs
on
are,
Facebook, and that's where you
right,
get all the
that's,
reviews.
That's where I would love to have you point those out to me, because that's exactly what I would like. This is why I went to the percentages of audience share, because I couldn't find reviews of that. So I would love for you to share those links with me, because that's exactly what I want.
Did you want to respond to the? So,
yeah, I just wanted to
yeah.
confirm or kind of join in with what Sergei said, in that Putin seems to be a singular leader from our discourse, from the Western discourse about him, but he's actually very Western in many ways, right? And he picks those examples from the West that fit his purposes the best. So I would say Berlusconi, for example, right, is very typical, and it's not coincidental that he's a close friend of Putin's, because the same kind of gestures, gesticulation, the pathos that comes into his speeches and so on, that is something that I think Putin learned from quasi-autocrats from the West in a similar way. And of course we did have theatricality and performances here, George Bush and others. They all do this in a very, very savvy way. They have advisors that. So to me, it does not confirm so much a singularity of Putin, but rather his typicality. He's a lot more typical and skillful in developing that than we
but
may
what
assume.
I also think is interesting about that, and I don't know that there's, I only see this inverse correlation that as Putin has become more theatrical in the Western sense, people start to watch less the Direct Line. And I wonder whether the kind of artificiality of this model becomes clearer, is alienating, actually, rather than they get hooked into it.
Well, he's a skillful performer. You have to give him that.
Yeah, he is a skillful performer.
Just a historical note from a connoisseur of Soviet agitprop, which emerges on a mass scale in the 20s at the same time as the so-called science of PR emerges in the United States. And the agitprop came out, of course, of social democracy, was based on a hierarchy of genres. So agitation was oral, propaganda was written. But in the 20s, it was based on differentiation by audience defined in class terms, so that would be directed at peasants and women, not class only, but gender and other political categories. But PR, as I understand it, and of course I'm not an expert, but it was marked by the use of psychological categories to appeal to desires, and it was especially sort of those considered fundamental desires, money, sex, and so on. And in the 30s, what you have is that differentiation of the 20s, and agitprop broke down, and it became much more sort of, because audience research, sociology was shut down. So you have this kind of scale becomes greater, repetition becomes greater. What I hear from David Brandenburg's talk, some of that is still there. They want to have a unified textbook to drill in a single unified message, but it's also being combined with these other borrowings, and so I would not necessarily see it as something, either Western or Russian, but of a kind of hybrid series.
Something that you just said I thought was really interesting, and I go into this much more in the larger paper, and that's the gendered aspect of what Putin is up to. It's clear, you see it most clearly in his campaign ads, right? But you also see it pretty clearly in the conversations and direct lines that there is an effort to appeal to women, right? But one really interesting article I read by Annika Chkayeva, I think her name is, she claims that the whole sexualization that Putin did of himself starting around 2008 really backfired, right? That this was something that really didn't work, that he couldn't put together serious politician and macho, highly sexualized international celebrity, which I think is an interesting insight into audiences, if it's true that those two things couldn't go together. And I was thinking that when you said Berlusconi, as being someone that he was, in a sense, modeling on, that this doesn't work so well for a Russian audience to do this kind of thing. But the appeal to women is really extraordinary, and a recent Levita Center poll claims that of all the groups, of all the social groups right now in Russia, the only place where Putin is experiencing a rise in his popularity rating is women 18 to 34, if I remember right. And you'd think, if you watched any of the campaign ads from the last election, from the 2012 election, you think, oh my God, how could anybody be taken in by this? But one of the explanations that one of the authors I read gives for this is that young women really aren't interested in politics, and that the only brand they know, political brand they know, is Putin, right? Because Putin has been successful in disseminating this brand. So when it comes time to vote, assuming that they do vote, which isn't necessarily inevitable, that they just pick the brand they know, and that's him. It's an interesting
That's interesting what you say, because this category is precisely the category that almost don't vote.
That
People don't vote,
point is
right?
made,
So,
right?
and it's true that sort of the majority of people who do vote, all the women usually sort of
Right.
retired ones, right?
So you have to appeal really directly to young women, and you see that so clearly in the campaign ads that, and they're just awful.
Well, let me just a very small note. The problem is that when you say that most of people and most of media are looking at Putin and his government and they believe him and they're interested, that's a kind of post-Soviet cliche, because indeed, I must say, sure, I'm not the only Russian here, but I'm quite sure that indeed the situation is much more complicated. Now we all are just the headless riders. Maybe The Headless Rider is the most prophetic novel ever written in USA, because there are no ideas and words in Russia. They all are conventional. That would be a brilliant situation for Wittgenstein, because there is no single word which would mean anything in Russia now. And nobody listens to Putin's speech. All the country is looking only for emotions, not for ideas or essences or programs or future. All the ideas, like left idea or right idea or capitalist idea, are compromised, like socialist idea also. They are looking for emotions, and so Putin gives them only those emotions. They are understanding the situation, they are laughing at it at all, but they look at it as a theater because they want to get the new emotions from it. Pushkin said once that talking to Nicholas I, he was feeling literally ignobility in all his body. Ignobility in the body is the strong emotion. And when you are looking at him, and when we are looking at him, we feel it. And it's pleasant to talk to him, to ask questions, you feel yourself significant. But the next moment you are laughing at it desperately. And when they go to smoke, all the participants of all these direct lines, they are laughing at him and at themselves. And those direct lines is the most favorite topic of anecdotes. But that's just the main topic. The most complicated topic is that we like to feel it, but we don't understand it as something serious. So that's a kind of to will-like existence. Everything is twice and double moral, we call it. And so maybe that's the most strong feeling in Russia now. The huge distance between your legacy, between your official feelings, and between your soul, which is desperately laughing any times. Like this.
Isn't that a Soviet legacy in some way?
Yes, somehow, but during Soviet legacy, I must say, there was a kind of ideological program. And Maria Rozanova, who is maybe the best known art critic of 60s, wrote correctly that Soviet power, who was the main criminal in Europe, sometimes sentences right ideas. And those right ideas, those right words were coming into our blood. And now we grew up with those words. We understood that, for example, it's necessary to help the poor, it's necessary to be kind, to share everything you have, and so on. Soviet power had maybe such false but program. Now we have no program at all. We have no any significant work. We have just a big theater with feelings, emotions, and ignobility.
Yeah, no, and this is what I'm hoping will actually be the essence of my next book, is this very theatricality. And I think too, it's very clear that when you think about the direct lines in the conversations, it has nothing to do with what's said. It's all about image.
Sure.
Right? It's all about
Sure, it's a kind of art, I should say. Because, by the way, sorry for my ideas again, because I know that it seems just too simple. But postmodernism, which we call just the absence of binary positions, it didn't take them away, but it reformulated them. That's the most impressive thing. Maybe the opposition of, for example, left and right, or socialism and capitalism, yes, it went away. But the new opposition appears, and we don't want to see it. This opposition, for example, is a position between complexity and simplicity, and that's the main in our times. And so I think that measure of your freedom is only the measure of the complexity of system. Soviet system was complex. Putin's system is simplest because it has no ideas, only simplest feelings like hunger, fear, exciting, and baseness.
I have
Nobleness.
a few people on the short list. Ksenia, do you have
well, actually, I wanted to originally start out as a question, now it's more of a comment because so much was said on this. But as you were talking about this kind of the new paradigm, I guess, I was struck by, Berlusconi to me was immediately the most obvious parallel. And he's also interesting because he's so laughable, and yet he keeps getting reelected. And I was also, what's really striking me is, thinking of like very, very recent events that kind of mark increasingly what makes Russia laughable in the West, something like Pussy Riot, or the anti-gay law, or the recent Yeregovo riot, right? It seems like the people in the top are borrowing enemies from the West, which is really striking to me. Like, there's still the Soviet need to have an obvious enemy, but it's ridiculous to make gay people your enemy. They're like 7% of the population at most, as opposed to the kind of enemies you had in the Soviet period where every other person could be an enemy. It's ridiculous, but it seems like they're restaging this culture battle because they're just looking somewhere for ideas of who's going to be our next enemy. Pussy Riot, radical feminism. A bizarre enemy to look for in Russia. But there you go. And even like what happens with the anti-migrant sentiment, it seems to parallel so much the kind of the rise of the right wing in France or Austria, there's a kind of weird hybridization of looking to Europe, but the absolute worst parts of it, just as you have in Russian economic policy, so the absolute worst of neoliberalism married with the absolute worst of Soviet centralization.
I mean, the entire Russia Today TV program is based exactly on that. They do exactly that. And they bring it here very successfully.
Can you say more about that?
The Russia Today program, is anybody watching this regularly?
Oh, yes.
Right, Larry King is exactly that.
I know Margarita Simonyan very well. You're quite right. Yes. You guessed her.
They're borrowing those kind of not dominating views here from here and actually putting them in the center. So that gives them an audience that they otherwise wouldn't have.
I wrote, can I just mention, I wrote an article about the Pussy Riot thing. It's published in TDR because I was there during the sentencing, and so I hung out by the court. And you couldn't get in, of course. I was just hanging out watching the Orthodox priests. It was quite a wonderful thing to watch in its own way. But it is hard to understand why the state would spend so much time and so many resources on these three women who, if they had just ignored them, given them a fine for disturbing the peace, they would have just disappeared. And this is actually something that Pawlowski mentions in his interview that's published in Novaja Gazeta, is why did they do this? I mean, this is one of Putin's immediate past advisors. It says, why did they even pay any attention to any of this, to Pussy Riot? They're the ones who brought all the attention to it and made it a big thing. Why do that? It doesn't seem rational,
Isn't it good populism to just scapegoat a small defenseless group? It seems to be a classic piece of political technology.
Okay, so I have a bunch of people on the list. It's going to be Ahmad, and then Jonathan, and then you, and yeah, I have a whole bunch. Okay, I'm trying to keep up. So Ahmad, carry me back up.
Thank you. My question also goes to the textbook presentation. First of all, what are the psychological underpinnings and economic dynamics of textbook production and dissemination? Secondly, anytime a culture works its way towards a unified narrative of the past, subversive reactions are instigated by teachers, by parents, by older siblings, etc., etc. Are there any signs of that in your case?
I think the best chance that this whole unified textbook will fail will be on the economic model, because textbook publishing is hugely profitable. And Prosvещение is the major house that's publishing the rival textbooks now, but there are enough different textbooks being published now and making huge amounts of money that they're going to really fight, at least for a piece of that new contract. And I think that if it fails, it'll fail because of that, more than their inability to develop a narrative. You're certainly right, though, that a new narrative will develop subversive narratives. But I think that Sergei's point is really useful here, that this YEGE that everybody has to pass now, this unified state exam at the end of high school, is incredibly intimidating.
Oh, people can memorize.
Well, but they need it. This is where, from the grassroots, there's actually interest in a single narrative, so that everybody can memorize the same textbook, just like in the old times, and pass this crazy exam so that they can maybe get scholarships into higher education. The 1990s was a chaotic period of grassroots-generated texts. Everybody was writing texts. There were dozens of different interpretations, and as the new national mood looks back on the 90s and sees chaos, they also see this lack of a ready answer and the impossibility of passing these exams with high marks. So the exam really reinforces the need for an official narrative, and the official narrative, vice versa, reinforces.
So in a way, it plays into the dynamics of state versus nation and the interface between the two, right? The state produces what the nation would like to believe, or a great majority of them, right?
And it's a cynical reason why it's being embraced in the grassroots. It's a sort of a opportunistic reason. It's not an eagerness for this official line. It's to be embraced. It's to pass the exam.
I mean, the myth of the discovery of the Americas has lasted 500 years. there's that need on the part of the population for a single narrative because things are just too complex about the past, right? That's right.
Okay, Jonathan Auerbach?
Yeah, I'm an Americanist, so my question is, this seems very familiar to me, and it doesn't seem very distinctive at all. You say theatricality, I say as opposed to what? And you had a little notion of authentic democracy that you had set against this theatricality. It seems to me there's a larger kind of issue, which is a kind of collapse of the concept of the political, which is one reason why at the beginning of the 20th century you have public relations kind of filling the void, precisely because the notion of a public sphere of any sort kind of collapses. And when you're talking about borrowings back and forth, it seems to me, again, without saying there's not a distinct Soviet legacy, it still seems to me what's happening in Russia is a kind of global phenomenon, that you have increasingly urgent top-down statist pressures, and you also have a blogosphere. So the whole notion of a public or public sphere is at once disintegrating and diffusing across a kind of different sorts of power arrays. And so I agree, it doesn't seem to be so productive to focus entirely on Putin as this kind of figurehead. And it seems to me, you're talking about Pussy Riot, I'm not so sure the Tea Party doesn't sort of demonize and work in similar ways to, reaction. So I'm still not quite sure exactly the distinctive dimension of this.
May I just say about Pussy Riot, if you read the court transcript, you might have a little different feeling about that. I don't think, even though Ed Koch said after they were sentenced that he wished more of that would happen here, that we're at a place in this country, at least not at this very moment, where you could have that kind of show trial that puts these three women who are, they're performance artists, that you could put them in prison for hate crimes. Okay, I don't think that that could happen here yet. So I'm going to say, I'm going to posit that Putin's Russia is doing things that are a little different at this point.
But I think those kinds of protesters in this country get put away much more quietly. If there's a more sophisticated sense of PR, not to do it as a show trial.
The argument
but we've
is
got environmentalists in jail
locked
away for 10 years. We've got Manning in jail. Right? Snowden, if he comes anywhere near this country, will just be short of capital punishment. So show trials would be foolish.
Yeah, but let me suggest something a little bit different in the sense of what Pussy Riot actually did. Right? They did performances where there's no information disseminated.
Right, but there's a number of environmentalists who do these kind of performances.
Right, absolutely. Well, they're in jail in Russia, right?
No, they're in jail in this country.
Okay. Here. Okay. But they pass themselves off as artists, which is what Pussy Riot did. And in the trial, there was no mention, or very little mention, of the fact that this was a group of artists doing a protest, and to give these women that kind of sentence for hate crimes, right, against the Russian Orthodox people seems to me pretty excessive. Well, and yes, I do think, and I say this as an environmentalist, yes, kinds of things can happen to people who take oppositional positions to state. I think this was sort of unprecedented in post-Soviet Russia.
Well, let's take the people who went to Oak Ridge, right? Get in, sorry.
Oh, go ahead.
I'm messing up.
No, go ahead.
They go to Oak Ridge, right? They cut their way in. There was an 82-year-old nun. There's some guys in their 60s. They throw blood from another protester who died recently. They throw his blood on the wall. They're trying to make a statement about the nuclear security state and how vulnerable it is. That's theater, wouldn't you agree? That's theater. Then they start praying, they have bread, they start praying. They're locked away now for a number of years.
Okay, well, one of the things I would suggest, though, and this is one of the things I talk about in my
But
article, is
to
that
say
there is
that
a
would be
whole...
theater would be to give them credit. So of course the courts aren't doing that.
Okay, I'm going to
Right.
make a distinction here that was probably only meant to be clear to people in my discipline, and that's the difference between performance and theater. And they're not the same thing. Whereas if you look at something like Pussy Riot, they actually do have rehearsals, right? They wear costumes. They do something, they learn lyrics, they write lyrics, they do things that one could actually call a kind of theatricalized performance, right? But there's also the kind of performance that Greenpeace does and the people that you're talking about do that don't have that sort of theatrical process behind them. And I would make that distinction. And when I went to see when I stood outside in the trial, now the art is never mentioned in the transcript in the trial, but one of the most curious things about standing outside the courtroom was the string quartet that was playing, and around it were signs signs about art, not porno, right? So Pussy Riot is characterized as porno, but real art is the string quartet. And so there's at least some consciousness, right, among people that Pussy Riot was self-characterizing themselves as artists, making a political statement through art, not by cutting into a nuclear waste plant or anything of that sort, but they were actually making an artistic statement in artistic form.
I'm just going to interrupt for a second because I know you're next, but I think Misha Kaufman has to leave, right? I'll let you have your chance.
I just want to make a theatrical comment as a theater person. I think Dmitry Vujic said something important about the genre. He used the word comedy. It is all in jest. Everything that happens applies to Putin completely. When you see those, those TV shows, it is essentially stand-up. To use a word that's understandable to Americans. And the audience, as he correctly pointed out, is in on a joke. Like, everyone knows it's a joke. It's not serious. It's like all the, like what we said about institutions. Nothing is real. It's, everything is a kind of a, everything, it has shape and appearance of things, but it's not real. It's, look at the aesthetics of what's going on. Look at the new state uniforms, the way the state, medals and awards look. It's just awful. It's in bad taste, and it's almost intentionally in bad taste. And it's a kind of comedy. So one analogy would be stand-up. Another analogy would be, and that's, this is a kind of a genre, the kind of a stand-up that, say, professional criminals do for one another in a cell. Again, it's hard to explain to a non-Russian what that is. It's, Tiska Troma. That's what he does. And he always joking. He always joking when he says, okay, you don't like the court decision, you can appeal. Of course, it's a joke. It's it's a joke. It's deadpan. It's done with a straight face. But of course, he knows that we know that he knows. And
maybe the main part, the main speciality of this style is that the question is always asked in one style, and the answer is given in another. So we have just the imitation of absurdity and comedy, like this, for example, one of the most popular anecdotes about Putin. During the direct line, the young girl is asking him, I live in provincial city and there is no work, no factories, nobody works at all, and I have no job. I don't know how to feed the child. So feeding of the child is rather simple. You take child into one hand and a bottle of milk in another. So that's the typical style, yeah? And there are many anecdotes about this. So one style is allowed. You can ask anything you like and anything you want. But the style of the answer is always another. mainly statistic. Yes, you have problems, but generally the industry is growing on the 146%. Yeah, are you satisfied? Yes, sure.
But I want to add one thing to that, because I don't disagree about the comedic nature of this, and that was a wonderful moment in the 2013 Direct Line when he came back to, well, of course you can appeal, and surely everyone laughs at that. But Anna Pechkayeva pointed out another thing that I thought was interesting, another sort of theatrical angle on this, which was Greek tragedy. And she uses this model in the sense that, and you all might know better than I do about whether this actually happens, but that in the course of every broadcast, people ask Putin for things, right? There's a supplicant part of this. And one of the points she makes is that it's really extraordinary for people to actually get through on the call line or get their email through because you will actually often get your wish, right? That Putin will actually grant whatever it is that you need. And one of the most striking ones was the very first scenario, offsite scenario in the last one, was a family, provincial family, with 3 natural children and 12 adopted children, right? Well, this was a setup, right? Because they're trying to get into the issue of adoption and the whole Magnitsky thing and foreign adoptions and stuff like that. And what mom wants, or mom and dad want, is maternal capital for adoptive families, okay? And then near the end, they put up in front one of the children to ask Mr. Putin for a playground for all 15 of the children. And of course, this allows him to smile and say, yes, I'm going to get you your playground, and yes, I have legislation going through right now that is going to give maternal capital to families of adopted children along with biological children. So there's also this sense of that we have this sort of Olympian god who can dispense gifts. And I thought that was a really interesting, it may be a comedy, right? And the gods don't appear to give gifts in the comedies usually. But there is also that sense that, oh, if you can just get through on one of these lines, you might actually get your gift. Granted by the great god Putin.
Yes, and it's also, he's also, another side of it, he's like Dostoevsky's devil.
Oh, absolutely.
He's bursting from laughter inside. And, and the face is straight.
But isn't the question whether it's comedy for Moscow intellectuals, really? We are the ones who are telling each other jokes. Whereas for 50 or 60%, maybe more of the Russian population, they take it very seriously, whatever he says. And he speaks to those. He doesn't care about those, whatever, 200, 300,000 or 500,000 Moscow intellectuals, because he knows he can't convince them anyway.
That's right.
But he talks to those millions and millions of people who watch him and who probably believe him. I don't have hard figures about that, but that is my guess.
No, I completely agree. What I'm talking about is what I perceive to be happening inside of him as he does this shtick.
Probably.
Well,
when you think about, and this is something
I don't pretend to be, to analyze it.
I'm gonna. Can I take the next few questions because I have a rather long list. So Mila, right?
I have a comment related to the previous discussion of Putin's theatricality versus real democracy in the West. And I wanted to bring up a very interesting concept formulated by Ekaterina Shulman, who participates in Russian blogosphere and has worked as an analyst in the Duma. The concept of reversed cargo cult. When the most important cargo Russia is supposed to get from the West is democracy. But in fact, Putin does not, and Russian authorities do not believe that the genuine democracy exists in the West too.
That's right.
And this is what they have discovered, and that's why Putin feels so natural, and that's why his his performances are so Western-oriented, because he thinks that he now knows their game.
Absolutely.
Completely cynical.
Absolutely. Yeah, no, I agree. I also think, although I use the term authentic democracy, that's a little tongue-in-cheek for me as well, because there isn't an authentic democracy, but I think you're absolutely right. He understands it's just a performance, right? It's a performance here too.
And that's why the recent crisis in the federal government was so poorly reflected in Russian news. They did not understand what was going on, and that there was something for which script has not been written.
Mm-hmm.
There is a student. Go ahead.
I haven't changed, but you were saying it seemed kind of just imprudent to focus on the Free Pussy Riot girls. Like, it wouldn't make sense from a PR perspective. And I think somebody talked about maybe that would just, put a certain group on the spotlight, make somebody seem like a scapegoat, somebody that can be used for galvanizing people politically. But did you think that was just a poor decision that was made, or was there some kind of other possible motivation pushing for him to focus on that? If he could have so easily just let them be, and that would have served his purposes there.
I have to say I thought it was a pretty stupid move from a PR perspective, but one of the things that surprised me a little, because when I first read about this, it was on Salon.com, and I thought, oh my goodness, what's going on here? And then when I went to the courtroom, what astonished me more than anything was the amount of, the sheer numbers of anti-Pussy Riot people who were there, right? And it's not that Pussy Riot didn't have considerable support. Now, if you had watched, as I did, the news that evening and saw that none of the Pussy Riot supporters were actually represented on Channel 1, then you get a sense of what's going on there. But I do think that the targeting of, as somebody said, a sort of very vulnerable minority, it was an easy thing to do. And even, I was talking to a woman she's a sociology professor at the University, St. Petersburg University, and even she said they shouldn't have done it in a church, right? That was, that they would have had much more sympathy if they hadn't done it in a church. And so there's that space that I think was important, and I think it's also been very important to Putin, as we've talked about, the sort of lack of ideology that is in Putin's state at this point, that he's sort of famous in literature for not having any ideology. But my sense is that he realizes that it would be good to have one, and that the relationship with the Russian Orthodox Church is that opportunity. That's my sense, is that...
Are they seeking to get that relationship?
Well, if you read the court transcript, a great deal of it is about this hate crime against the Russian Orthodox people, right? As if they're a minority, which they really are not, but they're like Pussy Riot, this little group of feminists targeted the Russian Orthodox people, the believers, and offended them so deeply that it comes to be a hate crime. Well, nobody paid much attention to Pussy Riot until they did it in the church, because they had done a number of performances before that, and every time they got closer to a sacred national site, right? And the one just before the church was in the Kremlin courtyard, if I remember right off Red Square. And so it was that action in the church and the outraged Russian Orthodox people. And if you look at the description of what they did, the three women in there, they violated every gender convention of the Russian Orthodox Church. They trespassed into space that women were not allowed to trespass into, or any lay person. And so much of this became about their trespassing of their hate crime against the Russian Orthodox Church. Now, Putin has made some important connections with the Russian Orthodox Church. And I think that if you look at when you think about national identity, you think of language, religion, ethnicity, right? Well, the church is an important thing. And I think using the church, I think, was an important move. And when Pussy Riot went into that space, I think that has a lot to do with why they were prosecuted.
Okay, I'm going to take, so Volodya next, and then there was a woman in the back, and then Anita. So, are you going to say to Anita first?
No, well, I just have a quick comment.
Yeah.
I get a sense right now that in this room there is a certain belief that Putin is omnipotent and that he's behind every single decision. And I really don't think that he is.
Pavlovsky says he's not either.
You know, to put forward the anti-gay law before the Sochi Olympics was absolutely, you know, not something that I would think even Putin would do, but someone did. And so I really, and other decisions with the Pussy Riot, and I just think that he's not really, he's not in so much control as some people think he is.
Practically we control him, because you know that, for example, the order for the spectacle goes from the public, sure. The spectators want to see him brutal and so on. They are waiting for the time when they laugh at him openly. But now he is waited to be such an omnipotent person, which takes this anti-gay law, and then he is struggling with Pussy Riot, and then he supports church. Still, we like to look at such a horrible person. Sometimes we'll want to see a clown, and in a very soon time it happens, and he'll become funny, and the same spectators which are applauding him now will be laughing at him, for example, like in the situation with Stalin, as you recall. The problem is that now public is still not fulfilled by the idea of greatness. Maybe 1 or 2 years would be enough. And then his non-omnipotence would be evidence to everybody, even to America.
I think it's also really hard to see the shadow government behind him, because several of my sources have commented on that, is that really there's no there with Putin, but that there's a shadow government there that he is the face of, right? But it's really hard to get a sense of who those people, or what that shadow government is.
Catherine, let me take the other one so we have time, because we're gonna break for lunch in 10 minutes. So, Volodya, do you want to go ahead? Oh, and then, so Volodya, then there was a, she left, and then we'll have.
Yeah, I would like to build on Yuli's comment about supposed immutability of the binaries in Soviet history. And what struck me that general discussion was somehow framed by these binaries. We talked about Russia-West in some specific way, tensions. We talked about reform and the same time consolidation. We talked about simplicity and complexity. So again, this cyclical thinking and binary thinking about Russian history and Russian past, we somehow impose in our discussion the post-Soviet legacy as well. And my point is that it seems to me the very binary and the ability to overcome this binary thinking has something to do with historicizing effort in regard of the very emergence of this binary. I mean, late Soviet intelligentsia, and our discussion about Stalinism and thought period and then transition to stabilization and then again perestroika. We have multiple academic examples of smuggling this late Soviet intelligentsia binary into scholarly discourse, Kultura 1 versus Kultura 2. Or at the same time, we have Tartu School, the most classical example of this reproduction of binary thinking in a Russian academy, among Russian intellectuals. A lot was said in recent 10 years about the need to overcome this binary. Sergei Ushakin wrote something about the mimicry of the Soviet intelligence, or Alexei Yurchak's book about again the need to overcome it. And I think that it would be much more profitable to frame discussion in terms of the shifts between diversity and diversity. It doesn't mean that Stalinism was simple or 1920s was simple while 1960s became diverse. It's the way we're looking at them and perspective we're taking. So we don't have first desire and another analytical tools to see behind this veneer of simplicity, diversity. And it would be much more difficult to think at the same time about post-Soviet legacy in such way that we're moving from one alternative to another. And even the political stakes in the current Russian debates I think this idea that Putin, we can reverse into something totally opposite, really constrains the efforts of Russian intellectuals to move from this regime or to see the multiple ways that would enable to change.
Should I let Professor Lampe do to and then we can direct both of these? Yeah, go ahead.
Well, just a comment after coming in halfway through this excellent discussion on the post-Soviet period and Putin at the center, and noticing a number of comparisons to the American experience, as distressing as it is right now. But I must raise my hand and say that there's a fundamental distinction that sets the Russian case aside, because the Soviet legacy, and to some extent the Soviet legacy, is state power. Is state power achieved and desired to an extent that never exists in the United States, and also the Russian tradition of defying that power, whether it's the borderlands or it's the dissidents inside, and that's a binary that's at work. It helps keeps the sense of humor going. But behind Putin or behind others is a sense that there is this powerful single state with the judiciary, the executive, the legislative, in fact, not divided, but one, and they can be feared, they can be mocked, but can be overcome.
I could take a crack at the binary idea. I like that critique of the binary. I think that in the 1990s, binary decomposed, and the 1990s was a confusing time, and I suspect that maybe, I guess my immediate reaction is that this is a legacy of the Soviet legacy. The binaries are comforting, it's easy to get a grasp on it, and after the chaos of that difficult decade, I think people are rushing back to those paradigms because it's easy to work with. It's fun to work with, it's familiar, and it's not so confusing as diversity versus diversity.
No, it just strikes me that, you know, this what we're seeing here is that when the Americans talk about Russia, they're really talking about themselves. And so our discussion gets reverted to the United States, and that when the Russians participants are saying, you know, only we can understand this because everyone is in on the joke and we really don't see it from the outside, it fits into the certain long-standing patterns that I was attempting to show are part of this discussion of Russia and the West.
I also think this goes to the last comment. I also think this latest critique, Putin's critique about American exceptionalism has to be noted in this context. That is, you know, there are chauvinistic, ethnocentric, culture-centered assertions of this sort that one sees in this country, and they're made ever so subtly, of course. But you know, they're there, and you know, American exceptionalism is one such. It just does not make sense historically or in terms of the present society.
But it is a plank in the current Republican platform.
Of course.
And it was repeated then by President Obama, and so, yeah, he seized.
But he also owned it. You know,
he seized upon this, but of course the notion that Russia has its own path is absolutely central to this kind of episodic search for some sort of national idea. Right. So. But I agree that with the notion that was said that I think it's people in the Russian political system, and I don't want to only focus on Putin because I think there has been, you know, for various reasons, you know, he's standing in for everything that's going on. To actually understand the workings of the political system right now will probably take a little historical perspective because we don't have a lot of evidence, although there are people who observe it closely. But even so, there is this notion that if we had some sort of coherent ideology that had some popular traction, that would be a good thing. I agree with that assertion that instinct is there. Hence, we have these periodic attempts to search for something like sovereign democracy.
I also want to say something that a person I was talking to this was in St. Petersburg a couple of years ago, and I think this is probably explains some of the tendency to focus on Putin, is that I was talking to her about her own feelings about the ad campaigns around Putin and the macho Putin and all of that kind of stuff that surrounded him. And she said, well, you know, I don't buy into all that, but she did very strongly believe, and said this to me, Putin puts a good face on Russia. And I think what we see is the face, often. And if you don't spend time in Russia, that face is what you see for the most part. And it does come to stand in for Russia, wrongly. But to a certain degree, I think there are Russians who buy into that, is that particularly after Yeltsin, who embarrassed many, that this is a face that we want to project to the West, for better or for worse.
I'd also make one last observation, which is that Putin has been weakened, and he was never really strong in the sense that he could use certain levers of non-coercive persuasion that are present in some other political system. So we're getting to a kind of relationship between, say, state and society, which is actually what we're talking about, or should be talking about, as, you know, something that you know, is not necessarily, and partly it's because of the Soviet legacy of being exhausted with politicization and the inculcation of ideologies, and so there is this, that is part of the Soviet legacy too.
Well, I think we can have lunch.
Yes, lunch is ready.
It's open the next room. Thank you. Thank you.